Things to consider when buying your first sword in today's video. So before you buy your first sword, you should ask yourself a few questions. What kind of a sword do you want? Are you looking for something that's one-handed, something that's two-handed? Do you want medieval? Do you want Japanese? Do you want like a modern cavalry saber? Are you looking for early medieval, late medieval, or maybe something else entirely? Maybe you like some of the Chinese swords or something from a completely different culture. My advice is mostly going to be based around medieval European or Japanese swords, but it does apply across the board. However, those are the swords that I'm most familiar with buying. Now, as far as my experience with swords, I've had everything from $25 wall hangers to I have a $1,000 Albion Creasy that is one of my primary cutting swords that I've actually won a cutting tournament with and done pretty well with others. So there's a wide range of swords that I have experience with, so I hope some of this information will be helpful for you. Once you know what kind of sword you want, we can start narrowing down a little bit more. What's going to be the primary purpose of this sword? Do you want to get it for display? Do you want to get it for combat? Do you need it just to do a photo shoot? There's all sorts of reasons to buy a sword. Lots of them are good. There's a few that aren't great, but that's okay. Now, once you know what kind or kinds of swords you're interested in, ask yourself, what is the purpose of this weapon going to be? Do I want it for display? Do I want it for photo shoots? Am I going to actively do some test cutting with it, maybe on bottles or tatami? Do I need it to be a historically accurate replica, perhaps for something like living history or reenactment events? Or are you getting perhaps a dull blunted blade that you want to get for HEMA or some other form of actual combat training where you're going to be hitting each other with the swords? The answer to those questions are going to help decide some other factors to where you may get your sword. Once you know what kind of sword you want to get, you need to ask yourself, what is the purpose of this sword going to be? Is it for display? Are you maybe doing photo shoots? Are you going to be doing actual combat with it? Perhaps a blunt sword for something like HEMA where you're actually going to be contacting another person with it? Are you getting a historically accurate replica? You might need that for living history or some other type of reenactment event. Or it may be a few of those. You can always get a historical replica that you want to display. You certainly shouldn't be using a historical replica with a sharp edge for doing something like sparring, but you can display it, you can cut with it, and you can use it in photo shoots, which I've done with a few of my swords. So just because there's one purpose for a sword doesn't mean it can't serve a few purposes, but remember, they have to be at least within the same vein of capable. Now, if you're looking to get a sword for training or sparring purposes, then that's going to obviously have a blunt edge. But if you're considering participating in tournaments, then again, another good reason to talk to some of the local schools or look up some of the tournaments that you may want to participate in. Many of the HEMA tournaments that I participated in had a pre-approved set of swords, so I could simply say, here's my Ince for Heavy. They know the maker, they know the model of it, and it's generally going to be passed fine so long as the sword is in good condition. If you buy something ahead of time and it's an unknown maker, then they're going to give it a little bit more scrutiny, and they are full well in their authority to say, we don't know if this sword is safe, you cannot use it in this tournament. So don't throw away money buying a sword that you may not be able to use. Now, years ago, I was in another medieval group called the SCA. I did rattan fighting, which is essentially solid bamboo. It's not actually hollow in the middle, it's simply a solid stick. I never did steel fighting with that group. I only did 1 year worth of it in armor because I wanted to get in armor and see what it was like to fight with swords. For that, they do have some steel groups now, but the same thing as with HEMA or any other contact martial art, if there's groups that you want to train with and tournaments that you want to participate in, ask the people who are doing it already. They're going to be your best source of information on what you want to get and what you want to avoid. Now, perhaps your interest is living history or maybe some reenactment events. For those, again, talk to the people involved with it. They can often guide you in the right direction for something that will be of suitable quality or at least meets their minimum guidelines. Some of the living history, they want something that is obviously as close to historically accurate as possible. This means for something like mail, chain mail for common terms here, don't show up with something that's stainless steel or bright and shiny, because that's not correct. So you wouldn't want to spend your money on that and then show up and be told, hey, you can't use that. Same thing for a sword. If I were doing some medieval living history, which I've done a few times, some of the best swords that you can get for that are from Albion or Arms and Armor. They make very good high-end replicas, and they've been to museums to cast and get all the measurements and information for these swords. They're fantastic, but they're also expensive, and in many cases you get what you pay for. But you would want to ask around to make sure, hey, if we're doing this event, can I have this sword? Because some events may not allow sharp swords, in which case you don't want to get an Albion. So make sure that you ask, because the purpose of the sword is going to help drive what your choices should be. Now, if you're looking to do Eastern martial arts, perhaps Iaido, then again, you would want to talk to the sensei for the school that you want to train at, or perhaps they're already training at, get their guidance on which sort of sword they would like you to buy. If you're self-taught, doing things at home, if you're just a backyard cutter, you don't really have to worry about that. You're kind of free to get whatever it is you want. But if you're going to be showing up into someone's dojo and training with them, respect their authority, respect their rules, and ask them, I would like to purchase a sword. Which one would you prefer that I train with, or what suggestions do you have for me? Now that we've hit some of the high-level scope, some of the finer details here, realistically, what's your budget? It's great to look at an Albion and say, I would love to get an Albion, but if your budget is $200 or $300, that's simply not going to happen. Albions start at like $800 and run up the chain from there for over $3,000. They're great swords and they're worth it, but again, remember the purpose. If this is a sword you wanted to get that you're only going to hang on the wall, then it may not be worth spending all that money for it. Now, that's not to say that you need to buy an Albion or a Tamahagani sword or high-end katanas. There are great swords that you can get even now for under $100, and for $200 to $300 you can generally get some very nice swords. So if that's within your budget, then hey, this is a great place to get started. Now, sort of related to your budget, if you've got a higher budget, you may be looking at getting a custom piece rather than something off the shelf. This is great if you're looking for a personalized piece, but there are also a middle ground between off the shelf and fully personalized. You could send over a design or something to a swordsmith, and some will actually make to those specs. Japanese swords often fall into the customizable set for this, which means you're getting a preset blade, perhaps a preset tsuka, but you're picking the color of the ito for the wrap and some of the fittings for it. You know, you can pick out your koshira, what do I want for the fuchi and kashira. There are similar options on some medieval sword makers, such as Purple Heart. If you're getting a trainer sword from them, they'll let you pick the color of the grip on it. Albion also has a few options for the grip color. They don't let you pick other things like what the cross guard's going to be, what the pommel's going to be, but there are little bits of customization to this. And this is something to take into consideration, because if you have immediate need for gratification right now, you probably will not want a customized sword. If you need it in hand right now, be ready to buy something off the shelf. Custom swords take time, even customized swords, because it's not on hand ready to ship. I've waited months for custom blades and I've been perfectly happy with it. Just be aware that you're going to have to wait. My experience with friends with swords is they're sort of like Lay's potato chips. You can't have just one. So if my first sword was going to be a katana and I was thinking about getting a wakizashi for it, I would want to look for a manufacturer or a reseller that has a katana and wakizashi set that I can either budget for and purchase upfront together, or purchase the katana now knowing that I can buy a matching wakizashi a little bit later. It's not the end of the world if you buy a katana and then think later on, hey, I want to get a wakizashi, and you can't find a matching one, because at that point all that means is you've got a katana and now it's time to buy a katana and a wakizashi. Now you went from one sword to three. That's how it happens. An important part of a sword is obviously the blade. It wouldn't really be a sword without a blade. It would just be a handle. And while there's a medieval manuscript that shows a guy throwing a pommel, Most people want an actual sword. So think about what you said you wanted to do with your sword earlier. Is it for display? Is it for doing some photo shoots, some cosplay, something like that? Are you going to be actively training with it in a sparring type environment? Or are you going to be doing some actual cutting? Because those answers can help drive what your choices are. If this is only for display, stainless steel is fine. They're low maintenance wall hangers, and that's why they're simply nicknamed that. They're meant to hang on the wall. You should not be swinging stainless steel swords, especially at anything that may contact it, because they're simply likely to break. Stainless steel is a great metal for a knife that is a shorter blade. On a sword, it's simply prone to breaking, which is why historically you don't see stainless steel swords. If this is a sword you're going to be cutting with, there's a variety of options. There's 1060, there's 1095, 9260, T10, which is a tool steel. A lot more options that you can choose from for a blade that you're going to sharpen and actively use. But depending on which type of sword you choose and which manufacturer you're getting it from, your options may be limited, or you may simply have no option. They may only work in 1060 or only work in 1095. It's rare to find makers who will work in a variety of steels. It's more common in the Japanese sword market. For example, Albion and Arms and Armor that I mentioned earlier, they have their standard steel that they use, which is heat-treated carbon steel. But as far as I know, they don't work in a variety of steels. You can't say, I would like to order an Albion Lichtenauer and I'd like to have it in this steel. You can say, I would like a Lichtenauer and I want this color grip, and that's about it. One thing to remember as well is safety. If you're getting a sharp sword, make sure that you have somewhere that you can store it, that small children won't be getting their hands on it, or large adults who happen to not be very responsible with sharp objects. I can certainly say that I've known a few, and I would certainly not want a sword out around them. You can get things like a rifle case to lock it up in, which are great because, they have a spot for a padlock on them. They're already padded. They're pretty good for keeping a sword in. Just make sure that it's wrapped in something properly. You can also, lock them up. They can just be in a room out of sight where people shouldn't be going. But if you're getting a sharp sword, remember, even though swords are thousands of years old, evolution has not given us, leather skin or anything to that effect. We are still normal humans like we were 2,000 years ago, and a sharp sword that would cut back then is a sharp sword that will cut now. So just be careful around it because accidents can happen. If you're watching this video, you were already thinking about buying a sword and probably thinking about it very seriously. So if you're having any second thoughts, remember, the first sword is generally called your first sword because it is the beginning to starting a collection. I don't have any friends that have just one sword. It always starts as collecting and a gateway to more swords. Some of my friends stay within the same grouping of swords. Some of them have multiple types of swords. And that's what's great. Once you pick one, you may find that you have interest in a different type of sword and you can go in a different direction. Once you have a sword, you make friends with people with swords, you get to check out lots of other cool swords. You might be like, oh, I didn't know about this sword, let me play with that. Yeah, I definitely need one of those. And I've certainly done that myself a couple times. But if you're on the fence and thinking, I don't really know if I need a sword, well, of course you don't. Nobody needs a sword. Swords are cool, that's why we get them, that's why we collect them. If you have any second thoughts, banish those thoughts. Remember, do it. Buy a sword. If you're watching this video and already have your own collection of swords, let me know what your favorite sword is in the comments down below.